Hello, namaste. Since I'm coming from India, I'd like to start my talk this evening with the way people greet one another in India. And it goes like this. Namaste. And traditionally, namaste means I honor you, which in and of itself is a very beautiful meaning. But with a little help of poetic license, I'd like to expand that meaning to what it really means to me. Breaking it down into three words: na, not; ma, me; te, you. So when you're greeting someone else, you say, it's not me greeting you. It's the two of us greeting that higher power, that's why our fingers are pointed upward, that resides in one and all. So namaste. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. I want to thank the Theosophical Society for arranging all of this. Much appreciated. And I'd like to start off with a little bit of my history. I was born in Toronto, and I grew up there, and I always had an interest in deeper thought, but that couldn't really come to fruition till quite a bit later in my life. But in 1978, I got a doctorate in physics, in atmospheric physics. And then in 1979, I met my guru. And that was a turning point, something completely new in my life. And as a scientist, I had, and still do, have a great appreciation for the scientific method. And what he told me in our very first meeting, let's put it this way, for me it was very revolutionary, because he said, look, you can watch, scientifically, you can observe your own mind as it functions. And I'd never heard of such a thing. You know, in the normal physics experiment, or any kind of scientific experiment, we as human beings are experimenting on some kind of system that's out there. But he said, you can watch your own mind from a different perspective. And I'll get to all of that later on in the talk, of course. But that was the beginning of my spiritual path. And since then, I've been researching, writing papers, books, giving lectures, meditating. That's the most important part, every day since that day in 1979. And I'd also like to say, often people think that the spiritual path is sort of a path for a person by themselves. But my wife and I have been doing this together since that first day, and in April we celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary. So I'd like to thank her for her partnership and all of that. In the first slide, I'm listing what I'm going to talk about. And these are in sort of a random order. Meditation, oneness; physics, freedom; immortality. Kind of a shopping list. Meditation, of course, we'll get into later, but that's the scientific approach that allows us to do this experiment, to look into that inner being that I mentioned when I defined namaste. And what emerges from meditation and the study is oneness. That is a description of the universe as one entity, one being, beyond time, beyond space, with no separation. And of course, I'll talk about that later. Physics, of course, is my background, and I'll relate a few of the topics to physics as it appears to me. Freedom. Yeah, freedom is such a hard word to define, but in this case, I mean freedom from whatever binds you to thinking you are an individual human being bound to a body. And I'm going to talk about that later for sure. And immortality. Well, if we're not this physical being, perhaps we're something that is free of birth and death. And it's always good to start off a scientific lecture with something from Albert Einstein. I must be willing to give up what I am in order to become who I will be. This pertains to the new identity that comes when one starts meditating and discovering that their existence, who they are, goes well beyond the physical body that they always thought they were. And Einstein said, I have to give that up to become what I will be which in actual fact is what you always are. And then the Theosophical Society. I'm very fond of this quote. Every existent being, from atom to galaxy, is rooted in the same universal, life-creating reality. This reality is all-pervasive, but it can never be summed up in its parts, since it transcends all of its expressions. So all living beings, the entire universe, and here's the oneness, the same universal, life-creating reality, one existence everywhere. It's all-pervasive. It is everywhere, at all times and in all spaces. It can never be summed up in its parts. Now, this is very interesting to me because often will people say, well, look, we are all parts, integral parts of one cosmic universe. But oneness goes beyond that in saying, well, there really are no parts. There is just one. And it transcends all of its expressions. No matter what we say or do, that comes first, that universal reality. So let's start with consciousness. A good place to start, since we are all conscious beings. Even animals are conscious beings, and this is how we perceive the world, through our consciousness. We may not think about it very much, but as meditators, we do. And what I have to present, this is an important point. As I said, I've been doing this research since 1979, and what I'm presenting to you as the viewer is what I've found, my experience. And you see, freedom, that's very important. Freedom never begins with bondage. So I'll always say, whatever I say, you certainly are free, and you will anyway, to accept what appeals to you and not. But I'm just giving my own experience in this field of the spiritual path. Consciousness is often divided from matter. And this all started in the 1600s when René Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. Cogito ergo sum. And so by doing that, he displaced the consciousness of the thinking being from the human being, so that matter and consciousness became separate. And that's pretty much a view that's held pretty universally, I would say. And now back to physics. Well, you wonder, like, physics is a very physical science. It deals with the world, the physical world, the universe, from the smallest of quarks to the entire universe. And you might wonder, well, how can consciousness come into physics? And it's an interesting question. And back in the 1920s, physics, quantum physics was just growing. It was exploding. And there was a famous saying back then that even the most mediocre of scientists could do groundbreaking work because there was so much to be done. And a curious thing came up in that era, and it was called the fact that quantum physics could not give the outcome of an experiment. It could only give probabilities. In classical physics, if we know enough about an experiment, we can determine exactly what the outcome will be. I flip a coin. If I know the temperature in the room and the air density and the air currents and the shape of the coin, etc., I can say with 100% certainty that my coin flip will come out heads or tails, but not in quantum physics. In quantum physics, all we can say is that if we do this experiment, the result is 50% heads and 50% tails. Makes no sense to the mind, of course. A lot of quantum physics didn't. But what creates the reality? Because at a certain point, when we look at that coin, it's one or the other, it's not both. Look at, that's the key there. The observer is what comes in. Schrodinger's cat. I'm going to change the experiment a little bit because in his experiment, Schrodinger, it's a thought experiment, but he has the cat killed and I don't like the thought. So I'm going to change it to a sleeping cat. And basically, you have a box with a cat inside and the top is closed. And in that box is a quantum system containing a vial of sleeping gas. There's a 50% chance that that vial will break and a 50% chance that it won't. So before we look in the box, the cat is half awake and half dead. Asleep. Went back to the original experiment. When the observer, the conscious observer, opens the box and looks in, that's when the cat is one or the other, but not both. So John von Neumann, in 1928, I think it was, said, well, physics is physical, matter and energy, but consciousness is non-physical, and that has to be introduced into the definition of a physics experiment. We have to take into account consciousness. And when I first heard that, it appealed to me very much, because I think that's very important. And of course, as human beings, we normally experience three states of consciousness. We're awake, we're asleep, or we're dreaming. And they're all separate states. And when we're awake, we experience the world around us. And when we're dreaming, we experience a dream world. But that world seems very real at the time we're dreaming. There's no doubt in the dreamer's mind that what's real is going on. But when we wake up, say in the dream we had a dream that we won $1 million lottery. When you wake up, you don't have to check your bank account because you know that dream wasn't real. So in a similar vein, what we experience in the waking state has to be transcended into what is called the fourth state, which goes beyond all three. In Sanskrit, it's called Turiya Avastha. And that's the state we achieve in meditation. So where does consciousness arise? And the overwhelming opinion, among scientists in particular, is that consciousness arises in the neurochemical, the physical processes in the brain. And that's really hard to come to grips with physically. There's been all sorts of convoluted efforts. Roger Penrose started to look at microtubules in the brain to see where these processes could take place. And whatever people believe, for me, it's a case of, look, you can think that consciousness originates in the brain, but then that's your starting point, and you can't transcend the physical because that's where you're starting. If you think consciousness comes first and matter comes second, then you're beyond consciousness. You're in consciousness, which is beyond the state of the mind. Eben Alexander is a neurosurgeon from Virginia, and he had a very prolonged near-death experience, an NDE. And in it, he experienced a world that was completely different from his waking state. And he's a scientist, a neurosurgeon, and I'd like to read two quotes from his book. I was encountering the reality of a world of consciousness that existed free from the limitations of my physical brain. 2. The death of the body and the brain are not the end of consciousness. Human experience continues beyond the grave. Now, I have a little bit of change of wording there, because human experience, you're no longer human when you're beyond the grave. But his point is, consciousness is not limited, and it doesn't come from the brain. And that's the point of view that I'm going to accept here. So then, who do I think I am? My view of myself is Glen Kezwer. I have a birth certificate from the province of Ontario saying I was born April 27th, 1949. And I was born one day, and one day I will die. And that consciousness of identification with the body is very strong, very ingrained. Or is it? In 2008, a group of investigators in Sweden did a very interesting experiment in something which is usually called body swapping. It was Valeria Petkova and Henrik Eriksson of the Karolinska Institute. And what they did was, by a very clever arrangement of video cameras and displays and whatnot, they made somebody look at a different perspective. So here's how it worked. There was a subject and an object. The subject was a person, in this case a man, and the object was three different things: a box, a mannequin, and then they used a human being. And the subject was instructed to look down so he could see his whole body, as you normally do when you look, you see your body from the neck down. But what we was actually seeing on his display was the object, either the box or the mannequin or the other person. And what happened was his identification, just like that, transferred itself to the other thing or person. And he no longer thought he was who he really was, but he thought he was that other thing. So that, for instance, when he thought he was a mannequin, they put their finger, somebody put their finger, moved it across the mannequin's stomach, and he felt that. And then when it was another person, and in fact, they used a woman, he thought he was that woman. And when he shook hands with her, he thought he was shaking hands, she was shaking hands with him as a separate being. Here, let me just read, it's several sentences from their paper. The concept of individual swapping his or her body with that of another person has captured the imagination of writers and artists for decades. Although this topic has not been the subject of investigation in science, it exemplifies the fundamental question of why we have an ongoing experience of being located inside our bodies. It's not just ongoing, it's the whole life, of course. Hence, here, we report a perceptual illusion of body swapping that addresses directly this issue. Manipulation of the visual perspective in combination with the receipt of correlated multisensory information from the body was sufficient to trigger the illusion that another person's body or an artificial body was one's own. This effect was so strong that people could experience being in another person's body when facing their own body and shaking hands with it. So who do we think we are? I just like to include this because that identification would seem so solid and so gripping our whole lives. It can be dissolved with just a few cameras and displays. So back to meditation. Here I'm going to introduce a concept. And the word I'm going to use here is knower. And what I mean by knower, it refers back to that inner being I was talking about. When the thoughts come in our minds, we don't get separated from them. They just seem so real, as if we are our thoughts. But actually, there has to be, even scientifically, something or some entity observing those thoughts that come in the mind. And I'll use the word knower because it knows the thoughts. And many other terms are often applied to knower. And in fact, it's better to use a lot of terminology, because this is stuff that the human mind can't really grasp. So the more words we use to describe it, the easier it is to come to understand what we're talking about. Although ultimately we do have to meditate to get it. So we can call the knower the self. And I like to use a capital S, because self we usually think of as our physical being, but the self, which is our innermost being, the knower, which perceives our thoughts. The witness, witnessing what's happening in our minds. The observer, just like the observer in von Neumann's experiment, the observer of the thoughts. A knower, for many people, is a foreign concept, a new concept. Maybe many people have heard of it or make sense, but I find that people who even have never thought about it often have it somewhere as an inkling in the back of their mind. And I'd like to tell a personal story about that, which happened to me, I think, around 1989. I was in the Indian city of Kanpur in the state of Uttar Pradesh. And I was, as I've done in many places, giving a talk on meditation. And my audience that day was a group of 12 young businessmen, members of the Rotary Club. And they had been invited to India to participate in an exchange program. 6 of them, one team was from Canada, my country, And the other was from Argentina. Now, the Argentinian guys didn't speak much English. And each team had a leader who was quite a bit older and a senior man. In the Argentinian case, it was a man named Dick. And this was our first meeting. We later on became good friends, but he would do consecutive interpretation of my words. So I would speak maybe 2 sentences, and he would translate. And, you know, my Spanish is decent, so I knew that what he was saying reflected pretty well what I meant, what his translation reflected it quite well. The only time he stopped me was the first time I got to the word knower. And then he said, "Stop, now, I don't understand what you mean." So I gave an explanation similar to what I just said now. The one who is watching the thoughts that come and go in the mind. The one, the being, who is not affected by those thoughts, but is free to choose which thoughts are good and useful and which thoughts aren't. And I said a few more sentences like that, and then all of a sudden, his eyes lit up. His finger went up like this. He says, "Ah," he said in Spanish, "El que sabe. El que sabe." The one who knows. But then what he said was beautiful. He said, "You know, my whole life I've known about the knower, but I've never heard it expressed in words before." So I think many people are familiar with the knower, and if not, then it's a concept that takes some getting used to, but it's, for me, and once again, my own experience, it works in meditation. And we'll meditate a little later on. In fact, I want to do a meditation with everybody, with you who are watching. But in meditation, we put our attention on the knower. Now, what is the outcome of the, shall we say, the spiritual study, meditation, the spiritual path? It's oneness, as I said before. And back to the Theosophical quote there on the slide. Same universal life-creating reality is in every being. One and one and the same in every being. No second, nothing else. And, you know, to describe these things, we often use metaphors. The metaphors bring to mind a picture which our minds as intellectual beings can grasp, because ultimately the knower is beyond our mind, it transcends it. And Indian philosophy is rife with these kind of metaphors. I'll mention a couple here. One of them is waves on an ocean. You know, when you're at the beach and you see the ocean waves just flowing in, each wave is different. Size, different speed. Some are white capped, some aren't. They all look different, separate. That's not oneness. The oneness means every wave is water. Now, that means when we look out at the world, using that metaphor, everything we see is our own self. Behind it, its essence. Once again with a capital S. Just like all the waves are in essence water and water alone. Gold in ornaments is another one used very often. People in India love gold ornaments. So it's a good one. So say we got a golden ring, earrings, necklace, different forms, different shapes entirely. They look to our vision, the eyes, as something separate. But they are all gold, even though they look different. Gold alone is, it's only gold. Once again, the self alone is. The life-creating reality is all that there is in all of the universe that we perceive. You know, when you look in somebody's eyes, they're alive, even an animal. You know, this is a little metaphorical in a sense, but there's a light there, I find, a light shining out. And oneness means that light coming from everybody's eyes is one and the same light. And this brings me to a 3-word statement of oneness. And it goes like this: self alone is. So I drew a little diagram here, a little picture now. I have to say first, I'm not kidding about this. I was the only one in my high school art class to fail, in my high school graduation class to fail art. So this is the best I could do, but I wanted to depict what I mean by that. So in the middle we have the world line. I was going to use the word lifeline, but it goes beyond life, of a human being. And the two events, which of course we experience, are birth and death, very definitely. At least we think we experience them. I've got to say, I don't remember my birth, and I haven't experienced my death yet, but that's another question. But we take it for granted. We were born. And during our lifetime, that self, that knower, that inner being, that highest being, which transcends the physical, is always there. But before our birth, were we non-existent? Well, through meditation, I've come to know that no. The self on the left side of the diagram is also there before we're born. Simplistic diagram, but it illustrates my point. And of course, after we die, and this is what Ibn Alexander experienced, although he didn't actually die, but he knew that what he was, I'm going to use the word self, was there. There's a Dutch neurosurgeon also who became a great expert in near-death experiences. And as a young intern, he was in a hospital, and he went into a room. Now, the man in the room had been written off as finished. He was dead. There was no way he was going to survive, but he did. And the room was full of doctors and nurses and his family, and they were all thrilled. But one person in the room didn't look happy about it, and it was, as you can guess, the man. And when Pim van Lommel saw that, he realized, yeah, and I'm not saying that we have to be happy to die or anything like that, but this patient experienced something beyond the physical realm. And so that's oneness, waves on the ocean. Self alone exists. Now, physics can take us part way there, and it's always nice to get back to some experimental physics. And there's a concept in quantum physics called quantum entanglement. If we create two particles, and then they're separated, and they have properties similar, in quantum entanglement, we find that if we change the property of one, we physically change it without doing anything to the second particle, its corresponding property also changes. And the beauty of this is that the particles can be separated. It doesn't really matter by how far, but they have to be separated by enough distance so that a light signal could not go from particle A to particle B in time for the effect to be seen. And this is a real thing. It's very real. And it's been proven experimentally many, many times with particles and photons and whatnot. But I always find that entanglement falls a little short, because it's still saying, all right, all the particles in the universe are entangled. They're related, but we're still not at oneness, because what we're talking about is actually separate particles. And the essence of each particle, and the essence of the experimenter, and the observer, and all the equipment, that's self. So quantum entanglement can only take us so far, but not all the way there. And it goes way back to 1935. Einstein, he really didn't like quantum mechanics, and he tried to prove it was wrong. And in 1935, he wrote a very seminal paper called the EPR paper with a couple of other scientists, Podolsky and Rosen, saying that entanglement can't be real. And of course, after his death, but he was proved wrong. It is real, but oneness transcends even that. And so what we're doing here is two ingredients in the Indian tradition, and the Sanskrit words for them happen to rhyme. Gyan and dhyan. Gyan means knowledge. Dhyan means meditation. And we have to have both. Why? Well, as I've been explaining, we have to talk about the self. We have to talk about the ultimate reality. We have to talk to other people and read about our work on this journey, research, meditation. A lot of it is talking to other people. I find, in my life, I've met many, many people who are meditators and on this spiritual path, and just exchanging ideas and perceptions and experiences, and how important that is. But at a certain point, the mind is not going to work. It can't take us beyond itself, simply by definition. It's what experiences its own thoughts, and we have to transcend it to get to the knower. So let's just look at meditation. I find that meditation is a very scientific technique, in the sense that when we meditate, we close our eyes and just begin to watch. We don't have any premeditated biases about what will happen. We just experience what we're going to experience by being the observer and the watcher. And as that, we can't deny our own experience, because that's what comes to us in meditation. And yeah, back to a little bit to Indian philosophy here. 3 words which describe this whole process I've just been talking about, this thought process. Shravan, manan, nididhyaasan. Shravan means hearing. Let's take an example. Self alone is. There's a good statement. You hear it. Self alone is. But you don't know what it means. And Shravan, manan, nididhyaasan are only applied to, philosophical things, of course. If someone says, your credit card's expired, you don't have to apply much thought to it. You just know what to do. But in this case, self alone exists. Now I have to start thinking about that. What is self? What does alone mean? What does exist mean? Well, self is who I really am. Alone means there's nothing but that. And exists means that is real. It's more real than that which is not self. And in fact, nothing is not self, but it's the most real thing that we can ever experience. And so Shravan, listening, hearing. Manan means contemplation, thinking. Man means mind in Sanskrit, so we think about it. And nididhyaasan means meditation. We have to close our eyes and understand beyond the intellect what that sentence means and what the self is. Meditation, well, I always have to say this because there's a tremendous misconception out there that meditation means you have to stop your thoughts. And I can't tell you how many times I start talking about meditation and people will say, well, I can't meditate because I can't stop my thoughts. Well, how can you stop your thoughts? You can't. The mind is an instrument. Its job is to create thoughts. And that's what it does very well, as we well know. And you would never think that, well, my eyes should stop seeing or my ears should stop hearing. You'd never think that. So why would I think the mind should stop thinking? So meditation has nothing to do with thoughts. When you have thoughts in meditation, they don't disturb your meditation at all. Very important point. How so? Because you're putting your attention, your awareness, your focus on the knower. And it is observing those thoughts, but is totally not affected by them, not disturbed. Sometimes your thoughts will stop in meditation. That's excellent. Sometimes they'll come back. That's excellent too. You can never, my experience is you can never have a bad meditation. Whatever happens, it's only you, with a capital Y, happening. So we put our attention on the knower. Now, I use mantra meditation, and I find the mantra meditation works, and I'll give 3 reasons for it. Number 1, mantra, Sanskrit word means release of the mind. Using a mantra releases the mind from its shackles, from thinking I am an individual human being subject to birth and death. Mantra means mind release. Secondly, now you can close your eyes and meditate on anything, of course, but you want to meditate, or the object of meditation is meditating on the highest. So the mantra, and I'm going to introduce the mantra I use in a minute, it replaces those random thoughts with the thoughts of the highest. And so we put our attention on that. And okay, right now I got to talk about the mantra I use. On the slide there, the mantra, I've got the transliteration and the Sanskrit writing there. And the pronunciation is Amaram Hum, Madhuram Hum. Amaram Hum, Madhuram Hum. And what it means is, I am immortal, I am blissful, or you might want to say indivisible. And to me, that's a very high thought. So that is a good thing, a very useful thing, productive thing to meditate on. I am immortal, I am blissful. My true being transcends birth and death. And blissful not in the sense of happy or always in a good mood or anything like that, just indivisible, one and one alone. And we've all experienced a sense of bliss beyond normal happiness, so it refers to that. And so that is the mantra I use, but once again, freedom never begins with bondage. So if you want to use a mantra in meditation, perfect. If you don't, excellent. If you want to use Amaram Hum, Madhuram Hum, excellent. Whatever works for you, for sure. That's what I believe in. And many years ago, I was introducing meditation to a woman. She was actually the mother of an old friend. And I introduced Amaram Hum, Madhuram Hum. I am immortal, I am blissful. And she said, you know, I don't believe that I'm immortal or blissful. And I said, look, it doesn't really matter. Just be a scientist. Do the experiment of meditation and see what happens. So we meditated together for a while, and when she came out, she said, she had this big smile on her face, I really like your Amaram Hum, Madhuram Hum. So whatever works, once again, but this seems to, I can't even count the number of people who use this mantra, and they find it really, really brings us to the highest. So what I'd like to do now, as a scientist, to me it's very important that we perform the experiment of meditation right here during this talk. You may be an experienced meditator, many, many years. That's great. Meditate along with us. It would be wonderful. You may be meditating or just doing it for the first time. Please give it a try. And if you don't want to, you're free, of course. But what I'm going to do is lead into meditation. And what I will do, the process will be this. I'm going to ask you to close your eyes, once again with complete freedom, to close your eyes and just begin to watch. And I'll speak for maybe a minute. And then I will be quiet for maybe 2 minutes, so you can have firsthand the experience of meditation right now. So please, anybody who'd like to, if you'd like to, close your eyes, and I'll just speak for a minute or two and describe the meditation technique as I understand it, as I use it. When your eyes are closed, you no longer perceive the outside world. The eyes, the vision, form about 80% of all your sensory input. So you've cut off 80% of your input, and you're looking inward. And there will be something you see in front of your eyes. Some people see blackness, lights. I like to use the word space. and just watch that space and feel easy. Always feel easy in meditation. And then start to repeat inwardly, not outwardly, but just in your mind, Amaram Hum, Madaram Hum. Amaram Hum, Madaram Hum. Amaram Hum, Madaram Hum. And you will find that thoughts come and go in your mind. As I said, nothing wrong with that. You're just watching them. You're aware of them, but you're watching them from the perspective of the knower. And at a certain point, the thoughts may stop. Then you are what I would call pure self, you alone. And you may also find that the mantra goes away and you're thinking other random thoughts. Once again, always easy, that's no problem. Just easily bring back Amaram Hum, Madaram Hum, or whatever mantra you're using, and just continue to watch. I will say Amaram Hum, Madaram Hum twice, and then I'll be quiet for 2 minutes. Amaram Hum, Madaram Hum. Amaram Hum, Madaram Hum. And now, when you feel easy, just open your eyes, don't force, gently and easily. If you like, you can rub the palms of your hands together to generate a little heat, and just wash it over your face a couple of times, because this helps to bring you back into the world of the waking state. And I find that there's a kind of synergy with meditation. I very often meditate with groups of people, and the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So people meditating together creates a greater synergy than just individually, although meditating on your own is certainly very helpful. And even though this is interesting, I think whoever's watching this, if we meditate together, it will be a different place and a different time. And yet even then, I think the synergy will be built between you and me, because meditation transcends space and time. Just a little joke. I always figure it's nice to throw in a little bit of humor because it's a serious topic. It's a meditation joke, so it's very apropos. And it goes like this. 3 meditators decide they want to sit in a cave in total silence. So they go up into the mountains and they find a cave and they sit down. Total silence ensues for a year. And after that year, a horse walks up, or I don't know, what do horses do? A horse comes up to the cave, looks inside, and walks off. Another year passes in silence, and one of the meditators says, "Did you too see that white horse?" Another year of silence goes by, and the second one says, "It was a black horse." And after the third year, the third one says, "If you two are going to argue and fight all the time, I'm leaving." Now, sure, it's a cute little story, but it shows that meditation really can transcend time. And that's the whole idea of it, to transcend time and space and take us to our own true self. And I want to finish off what I'm saying in this talk by referring a little bit to the Bhagavad Gita. And the reason for that is twofold. First of all, everything, or a lot of what I've said, comes from Indian spiritual philosophy. And the Gita, the Bhagavad Gita, is, I would say with confidence, the most widely read of all Indian spiritual books. And for those not familiar with it, it was written, scholars vary in what they say, but maybe 2,000 years ago. It contains 700 verses in the Sanskrit language. And in it, there are two main characters, Krishna and Arjuna. So the story of the Gita, very briefly, is that two families, the Kauravas and the Pandavas, are royal cousins, and they both have rights to a kingdom. But the Kauravs' leader, Duryodhana, the bad one, he decides he doesn't want to give any land to his cousins. So he says, "Forget it, you're not getting anything." And Arjuna, the leader of the Pandav family, is so incensed, and he's got right on his side, moral right, that he decides to go to war. And he declares war. And the Gita is set on a battlefield called Kurukshetra, which, interestingly enough, means the field of action. And in it, Krishna is driving Arjuna's chariot. Arjuna is commander-in-chief, and he asks Krishna to drive his chariot. And then he says, "Krishna, can you please take me to the front lines? And I want to see what's happening." Well, when he gets up there, Arjuna is shocked, because the enemy ranks are filled with his relatives, his relations, friends, mentors, people he cannot even fathom killing. So he completely falls apart and asks for Krishna's help. Now, the Gita for me is just a metaphor. And Krishna represents the mind that, or the being who is questionless, has come to the highest of knowledge. And Arjuna represents the questioning mind. And they're not two separate beings, they're one and the same. And Krishna, through those 700 verses, tells Arjuna basically what he needs to know in order to live his life properly and come to know the ultimate truth. And basically, briefly, there's 4 different paths: meditation, action, devotion, and knowledge. And each path leads to the same message of the immortal, blissful self. But there are 7 billion people on the planet right now. In fact, I've got the number here somewhere. No, I can't find it. But there's 7 billion. That means 7 billion different minds that have different ways of doing things. So that's why the Gita offers different paths for people who have different mindsets. And even one path can work for a certain person at another time, and not at one time and not another. So I just want to end off with one of the verses, which is on the slide there, chapter 2, verse 23. And I like the Sanskrit, so I'm just going to go over it. Nainam chindanti shastrani, nainam dahati pavakaha, na chainam klerayanti apo, na sho shayati marutaha. And I find that Sanskrit, each of those verses is really a mantra unto itself. The Sanskrit language, as I said earlier, resonates with the mind of a human being, the eternal consciousness, to break its shackles. Somewhat like if you've got soldiers walking over a bridge, and they all happen to walk in step with the natural frequency of the bridge will vibrate wildly and break up. So Sanskrit has that property. And this particular verse defines the self. The self cannot be destroyed by weapons, burned by fire, made wet by water, or dried by the wind. Now, everything physical can undergo any of those processes. Anything physical can be destroyed by weapons, or burned by fire, or made wet, or dried by the wind. So this verse, if we think about it and apply those three items I said before, hearing, contemplation, and meditation, we start to think, all right, Krishna is telling Arjuna that your own inner being is the self, and it can never undergo death. It can never kill somebody else. It's immune to anything that the physical world can throw at it. And the essence of all of the people on both sides of the army, Arjuna, is the self. Now, once again, this is often a question which comes up. And it's quite a long topic, but why war? Why not pick something else? Well, for one thing, war is the most extreme of all circumstances that a human being can find themselves in. If Arjuna and Krishna were sort of sitting in Arjuna's living room watching Netflix, and then he fell apart, it wouldn't have the same impact. So war is very important, but also I think it's very important to know that this is simply an analogy. It's a metaphor. And I always take it as that. Not that Arjuna is hearing from Krishna, will just go and kill inadvertently or whatnot. Just take the knowledge, which I'm saying you have to apply to your life, and become one with that, which is that the self is beyond birth, beyond death. It is immortal. It can't be destroyed by weapons, burned by fire, made wet by water, or dried by the wind. It is all that there is. Arjuna, you are that. The Gita isn't just meant for one person, for Arjuna. It's meant for all of humanity. Everybody should know, Krishna is saying, that you are that. One of the great sayings in Sanskrit philosophy, they call them Mahavakyas, great sayings is Tat Tvam Asi. Thou art that. That means self. You are nothing but that. And this is my finding through 40, 50 years of meditation and practice. And I just want to say it's been a pleasure speaking to you all today, or whoever's watching this, and that it's been something which I like to do. I like to share what I've learned. So it's just a great opportunity for me to be able to do that. And I will end with the same way I began, and that is with Namaste. Thank you.